I hope that introduction was short enough for you, Vivienne.
Sorry?
I hope that introduction was short enough for you.
Thank you, the best.
You did tell me that, people are always banging on for sort of hours and hours, and then you only get 2 minutes to speak, and it's a bit of a waste of time, isn't it?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. When Vogue did their thing, Alexandra Schulman, it was.
Sorry, it has to be really, really close. Sorry, these microphones have to be very, you have to bring them really, really close, as if you're virtually eating them. So you know that I was given my orders before not to bang on with huge lyrical introductions, because Vivienne probably gets those wherever she goes. She's very kindly agreed to have a bit of a chat with me about her life and her work and her values. And it's really, I think, the values that we share most in common. She's, amongst so many other things, she's a trustee of the Civil Liberties Trust, I'm very proud to say. And then towards the end, she's going to take some questions from all of you as well, because that's the kind of generous person that she is. But Vivienne, let's begin wherever you think this story begins, because I know it'll matter to people. Your journey will matter, your personal journey will matter to some extent to people. I'm interested in the fact that you were a teacher for nearly 10 years before you became a designer. What made you want to be a teacher, and then what made you change?
I was a teacher for a total of about 5 years, solid for 2, and then because I had 2 children, it was off and on in between. So I became a designer because I could make clothes. I'd been making my own clothes as a teenager, and I loved going dancing and making lovely dresses and stuff. Even made suits. And I had a very small amount of money. My parents weren't very poor or anything, but they gave me less than any of my friends. And I've spent my money on shoes and made my own clothes. Anyway, it was Malcolm McLaren, my boyfriend, who had the idea that rock and roll was going to be something that people would be interested in again. It was when hippies were being, their main power was sort of dwindling a bit. I think hippies were absolutely brilliant, and they politicized my generation. Anyway, so it was the idea of rock and roll, and we started by going down East End markets and buying up small, what were they called, EPs and LP records, with the idea that we could resell them to 20 people. Then we looked for a stall, and we didn't get one, but a shop which is 430 Kings Road, which is a shop I've still got. It's called WOWLDN now, because that's the area of it, and it's a good name. Anyway, but so we went into the back half of that shop. They weren't doing very well, and eventually we took over the whole shop, and we saw these, and I started to make some of these 50s clothes, and that was. And then eventually, that shop, what happened with that shop is we kept changing the idea. Instead of doing a fashion show with a new concept, we just changed the shop and the decor and the name, and we put different things in there. And eventually, we did punk rock. That was in line after about 4 collections, 4 different changes to the shop, where it kept getting nearer and nearer to something. And that something was the idea of an urban guerrilla. And it was the idea of anarchy and the idea that the world was so mismanaged that we hated the older generation because they weren't doing anything about it. And I don't hate the older generation now, because I've been trying to do something about it all my life, but
Well, hang on a minute. I've got to stop you, Vivienne, because
well, I finished actually.
You just said, oh, and then we did punk rock.
Because I think young people know less and less, and so I've
got to stop you because you're far too self-effacing, as always. You said, oh, and then we did punk rock, like somebody would say, oh, and then I had a cup of tea. Punk rock is now regarded as a moment of cultural revolution and excitement and genius in the kind of in the cultural history of this country, and you just said, oh, we just did punk rock, but what was it? Why that moment, and where the inspiration? And you described it quite politically, but what else was going on that made that happen?
Well, it was definitely in my case a political motive. Because, as I said, the hippies did politicise my generation, and we knew that dreadful things were happening. And so somehow we just wanted to engage the younger generation, and it was political. And maybe, I think it's really good, but it's a bit silly to think of fashion as a crusade. But nevertheless, it is something, it is culture, and it is part of getting a great life, And I wanted the world to be a better place. And when you're a fashion designer, you sort of design in a capsule. This is how you want people to be, like they are at the moment, but better. Anyway.
And anyway, you've always combined that sort of passion for how you'd like the planet to be with your art, and you kind of said again, slightly self-effacingly, but fashion isn't a crusade. How do you feel about, say, the critics who would say, oh, well, fashion is superficial and not a crusade, and why should somebody like Vivienne Westwood, who's dressing supermodels on catwalks, be someone we should listen to about climate change or civil liberties? What would you say to that kind of criticism?
Well, I think what I just said about get a life. I think it makes you have a better life. Dress up and stand tall and stick your neck out and try to express who you are and attract people. And I use my fashion as an excuse, a platform to talk politics. And I managed to do that for quite a few years because at one time I didn't. It was just, I've been very proud of inventing silhouettes and things that didn't exist before. But at one time I decided to put slogans back again into my collections because it's very difficult to give a fashion message, political one, if you don't use slogans. So I started doing that. But it's up to people who want to. To me, it's not an interesting topic of conversation. Is it superficial? Is it isn't? It's up to people. And let me just say that my maxim at the moment is, because I'm so concerned about climate change, is buy less, choose well, make it last. I think all this consumption, well, it is superficial. And it's not a real choice. Anyway, a real choice is what I've just said, Take really your time. Yeah.
It's interesting because, let's face it, Vivienne, unlike you, I am not known for my fashion sense. If I'm looking vaguely okay today, it's because I'm head to toe in La Westwood, right? Yeah. Not always the case. I need to, choose better, clearly, more often. But I do recall that authoritarian regimes throughout history and all over the world try to enforce a uniform on their people. Try to enforce a uniform. So if you think about fascist states, if you think about, you know, communist China, there was a time when people literally had to all wear the same and wear a little uniform. When I reflect on that, I don't think that clothing is so superficial anymore. As you say, it's a very important, potentially a very important part of expression and autonomy and human dignity, I think. But,
yeah, okay.
but you would agree with that. Let's talk about your activism, because that's what you really want to talk about.
I mean, I think it's true in the case of Maoist China, you know, that people should all look the same, and somehow that would make them ciphers, and that the individual wasn't important, you know, and they had to sort of fit in with some sort of plan, which, as we know, turned out to be completely anti-people. Anyway, so that's true. But earlier on than that, there were sumptuary laws where only rich people were allowed to wear certain things. And that was a lot to do with trade. But it was, anyway, and clothes all got handed down to people eventually. Anyway, yeah.
How important is your political activism to you in a sort of, in this, you know, because you're running this business. At the end of the day, you do have a business and you do have work to do as a designer, and people are hungry for your ideas and your products and all the rest of it. But on the other hand, you are so obviously a political activist, particularly on human rights and climate change issues. How do you see the balance between the two?
Well, sorry, but I always sort of make an answer bigger than it should be, probably. And I want to say that culture is really, really important. And I don't quite know how I wanted to tie that in, but I cared first of all about suffering, and as I've mentioned the phrase, the world is completely mismanaged, but purposely mismanaged anyway, for the vested interest of a few people. And so first of all, way back, this is why I wanted to tie in culture. I think it's so important to engage with the past. Up until the urgent shock of the urgency of doing something about climate change, I had looked on the world as must stop suffering, must stop war. It could be me, you know, this poor little baby that's just had its arms and legs blown into the sky and it's screaming, and will it live? And I mean, and this little black person who's crawling along the street with a flower, trying to see if somebody would buy the flower or help, and she can't even walk, the most beautiful little thing. And the idea of, you know, people, as Shami said, you know, being victims that are just picked on because they happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and they are then killed or imprisoned, in the case of what's happening in America, in concrete cells for the rest of their life, in solitary confinement. I mean, 40 years not seeing anybody, and you're stuck in there. I mean, this kind of thing. So I always cared about that. And culture for me is, how did people see the world? And that's what it shows you, because we didn't change. Cavemen were the same as us. They saw the world according to the circumstances and their environment, and culture was the way in which people evolved. Evolution. Culture is an evolution of human beings becoming more and more wonderful than they are. It's an intellectual evolution of the human race. Anyway, and we don't have any much at the moment, because people have been trained up to be consumers, and that's nothing to do with being engaged with the world at all. It's to do with sucking up. Anyway, so these were all my interests until I got the shock. I knew that environment was a problem, but It is so bad. We are in the most incredible danger. You know, I mean, I don't know if this takes too much time to tell, but...
No, we're listening, trust me. You could hear a pin drop, you can tell.
But, for example, there is a biologist. It was quoted in the beginning of Noam Chomsky's book called Survival or Hegemony of America, that is. You know, we've got the one or the other. We either survive or we have American hegemony. You know, we don't have any, that's the problem. And he cited a scientist who said that we, like we are, we've been around for only 100,000 years. Of course, there were people 2 million years ago, but they didn't have the intelligence that we had and the powers of social engagement and everything that we have. Our character, our human being character, is only 100,000 years old. And then he said that since the beginning of life on Earth, there have been, I can't remember how many billions of different life forms. All of them, the average of how long they last is 100,000 years. And maybe it's our time to go. Anyway, and we're nearly on the point of it. We face mass extinction. It's being hidden from us because our rulers still pursue their own vested interest. They've been trained up to think that the mass of people do not understand what's good for them. Only they know what's good for them. They believe in what they do. They believe that to squeeze out all the money from the world and that it ends up in a bank through the process of going through corporations, that it will eventually be paid for by the taxpayer. Meanwhile, these banks, anyway, I'd like to talk about that formula in a minute, but they believe that that is good for people, and they still pursue this trickle-down theory that they know best about. And they're completely anti-people, and we're not being informed. Anyway, and I would like to tell you how the banking system works.
But just before you do...
But there's one more thing I want to say as well. But
go ahead. I was thinking about the way that you began with saying, you know, with a sort of little glint in your eye and a smirk on your face, that back when we were doing punk, we hated old people, but I don't hate old people anymore. But you are always still about learning from history and connecting with history and learning from the past. And I just wonder what 70-something-year-old Vivienne would say to young punk Vivienne now, if you had the opportunity to inform that young woman who was doing her work on King's Road and trying to change the world. What would you say to her now, in the light of all this experience that came afterwards of culture and activism and what happened in the world?
Well, I'm going to tell you what I say to young people who send me... I've got to tell you these two things, but not for the minute, but just to remind you. One of them is... about we've only got 10 years left, apparently, to do anything. And I'd like to tell you about that, plus this banking system. But what happens when people write to me and they say, you know, like, my daughter or me, myself, you know, I've done everything possible to become a fashion designer. I'm now taking these kind of exams and I want to do this and can I come as an intern and all these things. And what I say to them is, you cannot be a good fashion designer unless you have deep interests. And in this sense, fashion teaching is very, very superficial. It's all about looking at magazines and getting storyboards and putting your ideas on the board. And it's all about the idea of the mistake that the 20th century propaganded. And that is that everything comes from you. The past is rubbish. And that I'm talking about culture. That's what makes a fashion designer. You have to have ideas. Where do they come from? They come from the past. Anyway, and so what the 20th century did was tell people that the past is rubbish. Henry Ford, have 2 cars. History is bunk. That was his expression. How often do you hear of something being conserved to the dustbin of history? Can I tell you that the human race has forgotten more than it knows? Anyway, can I carry on? Sorry. Yeah. Well, so anybody who wants a job in fashion, it is, what else are you interested in? Biology, do that. Don't do fashion. But if they really have to do fashion, then you have to have ideas, and you have to know who people are and the genius of the human race and what they were capable of, and how people saw the world 10 years ago, how your mother saw it, how your grandma saw it, how William Shakespeare saw it. You've got to know these things, how the cavemen saw it, everything. This is what culture is. And anyway, so it's reading, going to look at wonderful art. You know, art is a story without words. It's direct experience. You've got the message, you've got the beauty, you've got the potential of the human race and what it can express. It's a poem without words. I mean, there's so much to discover. And so if you want to be a fashion designer, then it's like having a fridge. And you've got this food in it, but you need to put other food in there. Everything doesn't come from you. You have to get it from somewhere. And my motto is, you get out what you put in. And so it's terribly important. Anyway, so that, but I think the overriding problem is to do with climate change, and we should talk about that as well, which we are going to do, but yeah. Mm-hmm.
I don't want you to forget, you said you wanted to talk about banking.
Yeah.
You were going to, share your thoughts on the banking system.
Yes. I'll just quickly say the other thing as well, because it only takes a minute, which is that the hope, apparently now, that scientists are telling us, you know what runaway climate change is. It's when everything it gets too hot and everything kicks in and you can't stop it. And there's been a statistic of 2 degrees. Once it goes beyond 2 degrees, we can't stop it, it will go to 5. And if you drew a line parallel with Paris, 5 degrees, everything below that is uninhabitable, except the Antarctic starts to be habitable. So goodbye, Florence, goodbye. My shock about climate change was when, in an interview, James Lovelock said that at the end of this century, he would guess there would be 1 billion people left. I mean, that is impossible to imagine what happens in between. Anyway, so we're not told about this. People are just pretending, and you'll never... But if we keep our same political system, you'll never deal with this. The hope, I was telling you, is that in 10 years, we could stop runaway climate change. We might be too late. It might be already in the pipeline, but we've got to behave as if it is possible. And if we can reduce emissions by 80%, my mathematics tells me that we've got to cut our emissions down to 1/5 of what they are. Nobody's started. And I think you have to start even by saving plastic bags. Once you start doing something, if you give £5 to a charity, whatever it is, you start to get engaged. And without public opinion, we've got no chance. And I know that politicians aren't listening to people, but with enough people talking to each other, understanding and caring about these things, that is the only possible hope. So whatever you do, you have to get engaged with things. And to me, I talked about culture, and everything goes together. I think going to an art gallery helps climate change. For a start, it gets you off the consumption treadmill, and you start investing in the world. Anyway, so that's how that links. But the money problem, the money system. Now then, a few months ago, there was a woman, a new whistleblower. She's called Karen Hoods. She was working 20 years in the World Bank. And she said, I'm going to come out now and explain what's going on. And I'm going to get through to people, because not only me, but a lot of my colleagues and other people are going to help me to get the public to know about this. Now then, what she said isn't new. A lot of people did know about this before, but she's made it very, very clear. And what she said is, she said, the world is ruled by an elite. Now then, I don't accept this word elite, because you can't have a military elite, or an elite is something to be respected, not an elite of the rich. I mean, I don't use this word ever. So she said, and so I just changed it from the world is ruled by a certain elite to who are our rulers? Who is it who is ruling us? And they are the central banks. And out of all the thousands and thousands, of course, of banks in the world, there's loads even in your high street. But of all the thousands of banks, there are 147 which are privately owned. The American Federal Bank is privately owned. It's one of them. The worst of these banks is in Switzerland, in Zurich. I can't remember what the name is, but it's the central bank of all the private banks. And it was done by the Nazis, because they were laundering money, and that's how it was used for. But after the Second World War, what the people in that bank did is they got together with the other private banks, and they said, our aim is to own everything in the world. The banks must own this. So the method that they have of doing this is very, very simple. They print money. And we know they don't print it, they press buttons, okay? They press buttons. And, so I've just seen somebody I know, and it put me off for a minute. Sorry. Anyway.
Put your head down immediately.
Anyway, anyway, so I lost my train of thought, which is that, yeah. And so they print money, and then they lend it to governments or to corporations, Shell or whoever it is. And what happens with that is that the governments then promise to pay them this money back. And that money will be, and the promise depends on somebody not yet born, the future taxpayer, the baby that's going to be born in 100 years now, because the debt is so big that there's no chance of it ever being paid back. However, they squeeze all the time if they can, because they don't want this difference from the American incredible debt of bankruptcy, trillion, whatever it's near. They don't want that to run away too quickly. They're trying to sort of hold it down a bit by what I think they call sovereign money, which is money that's real wealth. It's real wealth because it's got from mining or potatoes or sometimes services as well. But essentially, where that money comes from is from the finite resources of the earth which are exploited. And that's how they get the money. And the world is run on debt purposely, because every time somebody borrows money, the central banks get this interest, and they are rolling rich, and they are starting to own somehow everything. But actually, there's no real difference between the money that they print and the money that's even on a pound note. It's just a promise to pay after all. And so money is really debt. Sorry, she's looking at her watch.
No, I just want to ask you about another area. I'm not trying to stop
but I
your
want
flow.
to give you one example of how this works, and then I'll finish. In America, because the squeeze is bad, we shouldn't allow a squeeze. We should have a different economy, one based on value, whereby you pay students to go to school. They're valuable people. We need them. Why shouldn't more teachers, more nurses? All services are wonderful. This is real money. Because why should the money only be in these banks or with very rich people? Why shouldn't real value money be being circulated? That's what's good economy, when money is being circulated, and it's got to be real money that's worth something. So the way to get out of this is what's good for the economy is what's good for the climate is good for the economy. What's bad for the climate is bad for the economy. If we would put this into practice, we would automatically get the world we want. We would have a beautiful world. I just wanted to give you that one example of a farmer in America who's got a chicken farm or a cow farm or whatever it is. There's a total overproduction of maize, and it's all used as sugar in food. They have to use this maize, which is easy to grow and very profitable. And but that's just one part of it, because what the farmer has to do, he's locked into a big corporation. As long as he's got a contract to sell his stuff, his chickens, whatever, to that corporation, he can borrow money from the bank. And so the chickens are dying, the cows are passing on terrible diseases to human beings, and they're living in misery, born to suffer. And it's totally uneconomical, because the bank, the farmer earns $20,000 per year, and he owes nearly £2 million to the bank, which he never can pay. It's just debt. The bank might be able to repossess his farm when he's had enough, when he hangs himself, whatever he's got to do. Anyway, it's just quite content to suck up the interest. That's it. But everything is not costed. Nothing. If you can buy a chicken cooked for £2, it's not being costed. Everything's being subsidised by this debt, including fashion. But anyway, we've got to change things.
Vivienne, you've spoken so beautifully about our climate future, our economic justice future, but I want to just touch briefly on human rights before I open it up to the floor, because we met in 2005, I think, when Liberty was campaigning against house arrest without charge or trial. And we wrote to lots of people asking for their support, and lots of people signed a petition, and it was a high-profile campaign, sadly not a successful one, because we do have punishment without charge or trial for terror suspects in this country still, even under the coalition government. But what I found so moving about your response, as opposed to lots of people who lent their name and lent their support, is that you wrote to me about how you remembered your civics teacher when you were a schoolgirl, and how you learnt the value of Magna Carta and people's right to a fair trial. And then we met, and you joined Liberty, and we became friends, and I realised that you'd been actually campaigning against various miscarriages of justice, particularly in the United States, for some years. And now we're looking at politicians and newspapers who want to scrap the Human Rights Act. Legal aid that allows people to have advice and representation is all but dead in this country. And I wondered if you wanted to finish your vision of what a better future might look like with what you think about human rights.
Well, as I see it, the increased problem that Liberty, Council for Civil Liberties, I call it Liberty, has, is that the people accept all these terrible conditions. They accept that students are supposed to pay, things like that, you know, they're not getting the education free. You know, it's like it's an investment in our future. It's people accept the most terrible conditions slowly because governments don't listen to people, and slowly they keep on doing things, apart from which people still do kind of believe this thing about we've got to have money all the time. And it depends, anyway, whatever. Sorry. So it's all about what have you got in your pockets, and these people are scroungers and all this, and we believe all these things, and we believe that the government will protect us against terrorists, and we've got to accept all these things. And what has happened is that the laws that have been passed by governments against public opinion, but they've passed them anyway. Just the same as when Tony Blair went into Iraq against public opinion. Governments have been doing what they want. They're getting really, really desperate. And and so what Liberty has got to fight. Normally, Liberty would try to work within the law and say this is not just. But when the laws are completely unjust, you know, and they're totally anti-people, then the job of Liberty is much, much harder. They can say these laws are rotten, but the governments won't listen. And and I do believe that governments are getting more and more desperate because, like I said, the financial system is crumbling. It's crumbling because their theory and their thing that they believe in, they do believe in this making profit all the time out of air and out of everything that's in the ground. They do believe in this. But the financial problem and the environmental problem, which I've just talked about, are like two snakes that eat each other's tail. The financial crisis is caused by the environmental crisis. The environmental crisis is caused by the financial crisis. It's getting more and more desperate. And I want to end by saying something that J.S. Mill said in the very famous little manual called On Liberty in the middle of the 19th century. And he ended his book, he used the word dwarf. I don't feel politically correct in using the word dwarf, because he talked about dwarfing the intelligence of people. And that with dwarves you can't do very much. And the way I would put it is that what he said was governments, you could do that in the 19th century, people weren't as politically correct as we are. But what he was saying is that governments, in order to rule more easily, will try to limit the intelligence of people. And that for whatever good or bad reason they try to do this, they will find that people with limited intelligence, with such people, not much is possible. And we've had propaganda from our newspapers. Most journalists are there to give us all this distraction every day, this total rubbish, to make us feel contented. We live in the privileged world. We're not thinking.